Fewer hunters, less wildlife. Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, there's a story in the Washington Post this week about somewhat of a crisis when it comes to endangered species and just preserving natural lands across the country. And that crisis is brought on by the waning number, the dwindling number of hunters. Most people don't realize this, but it is hunting licenses and taxes on guns and other hunting gear like bows and arrows that make it possible for states and the federal government in many ways to fund their efforts at wildlife preservation, at endangered species preservation, at even keeping down things like West Nile virus, dealing with that, sustaining pollinating creatures like honeybees. All of this comes from funding that's largely provided by hunters. And Bill, it looks like in the 1980s, some 17 million hunting licenses a year were being sold, and now that's down to 15 million. In Pennsylvania, my former home state, Pennsylvania has gone from 927,000 hunting licenses a year in the last decade down to 850,000. So as the population increases, the number of hunters is dwindling. Bill, I don't know how folks on the left are going to come to grips with this, because in general, they say we want to save God's creatures, although they might not use the term God. And at the same time, they would say, well, we don't want guys with guns running around in the woods shooting at God's creatures. Do you think that this is a problem that now the left is going to rise up and say, hey, we need to recruit and retain more hunters?
No, because if they were to use that kind of logic, they wouldn't be on the left anymore. Things like that are so easily explainable. I'm willing to grant, at least for some, very young level of intellect, that the idea that if you have fewer hunters, you're going to have less wildlife. You can certainly see how a child might think that, okay, if we take away the hunters, there's going to be more animals. But certainly anybody, beyond 7 or 8 years old is capable of understanding the argument that human hunters have taken the place of the natural predators in the environment, because we'd rather have human hunters than packs of wolves in our neighborhoods or just outside of them. So what happens is what prey animals like deer, perfect example, prey animals have evolved in order to have a survival strategy to continue on as a species in the face of wolves, other predators. But let's just say wolves to keep it nice and simple. And if there get to be more and more deer, then there become more and more wolves. And the more wolves there are, the more deer they take, the smaller the number of deers go down, the fewer number of wolves that can survive. And this is called the balance of nature. My father, also from Pennsylvania, lived, his house was just in Phoenixville, literally almost on the, across the border from Valley Forge National Park. And he'd been hunting in Pennsylvania since he was probably 4. And he died in 2002, but in 2002, and when I visited him prior to that, he said in his entire life, 77 years old, he said he'd never seen so many deer as he'd seen in his final days in the early 2000s. I bet there's even more than that today. The argument about hunting and the number of licenses decreasing is, I think, probably twofold. On one hand, it's external, and on another hand, it's internal. That's maybe not as clear as I'd like. The internal argument is that I think more people today are more sensitive to animals because so few of them have to actually go out and get the meat that they eat for dinner. This is, of course, the great hypocrisy of, or at the very least, the great lack of understanding of this age. We think that there's all these products that we like to eat, and we think they're grown, in patties, and they're not. And people have to go out and do that dirty work for us. And because we don't have to do it ourselves, we've had a chance to become a little more romanticized in our attitude towards animals, and kinder, certainly in terms of being less willing to just kill things, because I think we're a little more aware of animals as having certainly more consciousness and things of that nature than was assumed throughout the course of history prior to the 20th century. The other thing that's suppressing licenses is external, and that's the peer pressure put upon hunters by people who make hunting into the absolute heart of cruelty, that there's no worse person in the world than a hunter who could go out and shoot a deer, this kind of thing, this demonization of hunters. And this one is very clearly explained. This is a problem I could solve very, very quickly in this country. For those people who feel that hunters are cruel, and especially those people that have seen video footage of deer being shot by hunters and these animals going down, it's easy to say, well, my God, that's horrible. But I've seen those videos too. And I personally am an animal lover, and I don't particularly like to see deers get shot by hunters, but I'm enough of an adult to understand that it's either go down by being shot with a bullet or being torn piece by piece and eaten alive by a pack of wolves.
Or frankly, Bill, these days, perishing from chronic wasting disease or some other kind of disease.
I'm getting to that. If you've ever seen an animal being eaten alive, you will suddenly come to realize that this is nothing compared to that hunting is an act of mercy. And the other thing that you don't see, so what I'm saying is this: the case against hunters has been made by showing the act of hunters killing the prey animals. Again, we'll just stick to deer because it keeps things easy. So you see a deer getting shot and you think that's terrible. But what you don't see is a deer being torn to pieces by a pack of wolves. And more importantly, is the case you just mentioned. What you also don't see is you don't see deer starving to death in the thousands, because without hunters or predators, their numbers are designed to produce enough deer so that when there are predators there, the deer continue. Take away the predators, the deer population explodes. And there is no worse death on this earth than starving to death. It is without question the most painful, awful agony on earth. And this is what nature is. And so people look at hunting and they say, oh, if we didn't shoot that deer, then the deer would live to be a ripe old age and go to deer retirement home and die peacefully in bed surrounded by its loving family. It doesn't work like that in nature. If a hunter does not take a deer, there's not an animal in the wild, there's not one individual animal in the wild that dies of old age that I'm aware of. Not one. Even lions, even top predators, are killed by other lions when they become too weak to defend themselves. It's like this whole idea that you killed that animal. It's like, yes, I did. And that animal was either going to be killed by predators in a much more horrible way, or it was going to starve to death or something. So I'm not one of those people that is blind to the consequences of what happens if it's not the guy pulling the trigger. And that's the big problem with hunting's image today. And this is why nobody ever makes the argument. It's like the argument to preserve hunting in America is not to say we eat the meat and all the rest of it, because of course the hunters do. I eat hamburger and I eat steak and I don't kill those animals because I don't have the guts for it, frankly. But what is never shown is what happens to the animal if the hunter doesn't shoot. And those two alternatives, death by predators or starvation or wasting away, are far, far, far more cruel, far harder to watch than watching what a hunter does. And this is why hunting has been so demonized, because nobody ever shows the alternative to animals that aren't hunted by humans.
And beyond the creatures themselves, Bill, I think that there's probably not a full appreciation in the American public, or at least that portion of the American public who now sees that or views decent activities for kids to include things like organized sports run through their schools and video games played in their homes. We've gotten beyond the generation that naturally, when you got to be 12 years old, when I was 12 years old, I got an Ithaca 20 gauge shotgun for my birthday, and that was just as natural as you could imagine. There were always guns in my home, and it was a natural thing to go out in the woods with my grandfather, and he taught us to hunt. But I think that folks don't understand the massive areas of land, especially valuable wetlands that have been maintained and sustained because of individual hunters and organized groups like Ducks Unlimited. If I would be willing to wager that the collective efforts of hunters have done more to preserve precious wetlands
Without
in this
question.
country than any environmentalist group has done. Not to denigrate the environmentalist groups, but just that's how important it's been to being able to sustain these wild lands.
Once again, I come back to the example of my father, who got quite a kick out of this later in his life. He said the person he became in the last decade or so of his life was the person who he fought most aggressively against in his prime, in his 30s. He was a hotel manager and big on development. And then when he retired, he began to realize that, well, first of all, it was a different world in 1990 than it was in 1930 when he grew up, 1940s. But he went from being a guy who was about developing properties to being a guy who stopped the development of properties, who kept these trout streams as pristine as they possibly could be. And even at the time when he may have been in his most materialistic phase or his most corporate phase, whatever you want to say, my personal experience has been, and without exception, is that the people who call themselves hunters have a far, far higher regard for not only for the animals, but for the environment. They're more dedicated to keeping things clean. They're more dedicated to keeping things in balance. They have a respect for nature that comes from being in nature. So many of the people who are talking about, oh, that's horrible, they've never been ever, most of them never put their feet on grass before in some cases. It's like, it's a little hypocritical to make moral judgments about people from an apartment complex in the heart of LA, let's say, or in a skyscraper in New York or whatever, and talk about what goes out in the wild when you've never been out in the wild. You haven't got the faintest idea what happens out in the wild. And one of the things that I've seen quite a lot of lately in hunting is that and this is a relatively recent thing, maybe the last 100 years or so, but as the weapons that hunters have become more and more accurate, 30-06 cartridge with a telescopic sight with a rifle, that makes it considerably easier than if you had a musket, let's say. Many hunters are actually kind of downgrading themselves. My dad, for example, became a bow hunter because he was just too deadly with a rifle. And so it's not a question of the kill. It's not a question of like, I want to kill things. There is in some people, more than others, certainly in my brother, much more than me, there is a primal instinct to hunt, and that instinct is very strong, and we wouldn't be here without it. And the people who do hunt, in my universal personal connection, show zero waste. They waste so little. They use so much. They have such respect for the animals that they're taking and so on. I remember visiting my Uncle Rock's house in Pennsylvania, and the first time I ever saw a deep freeze, and it was the size of a couch, and inside was, I don't know, just enough food for a year. And I saw deer being dressed out, all of that stuff. I can afford to be not a hunter because the food that I eat on a daily basis is hunted for me by other people, or certainly killed for me by other people.
Bill, I think one of the things that folks
sandwich.
don't appreciate about hunting too is that the vast amount of time that you spend hunting is in effect not hunting. In other words, you're not actually, you can go out for days and fire your rifle once or not at all.
Once.
And I know that there are many mothers especially who have young boys and wonder why these young boys are so rammy and everything. There in a previous generation, that rammy kid would have sat stone cold silent in the woods for 4 hours straight in hopes of seeing a deer. And the value of just having time in nature, time in silence, time to listen and observe, I think is something that brings more to the table, especially for young boys. And the government is making efforts. They're trying to recruit and retain people who are already hunters and reinvigorate those who were not hunting. They're trying to actually setting out food trucks with wild game food on it to try to appeal to this whole new growing movement of locavores, people who insist on eating locally grown meats. But frankly,
leaner, no hormones, none of that stuff.
None of them think that it's going to be enough because they just see the number of hunters dwindling so badly that they're trying to come up with new funding models, taking money out of the general budget of the states that used to come from user fees and taxes specifically on hunting related things. There may come a time when your taxes have to go up because people are no longer hunting.
I'd like to see my taxes go down and have some of those taxes spent to replace the revenues from hunting licenses, because I think maintaining wildlife is one of the few things that I could credit the federal government with having legitimate purpose for. I'm not entirely sure that's correct, but it's certainly a lot more legitimate than most of the other reasons that we put our tax dollars into the government. And, one of the things that's also happening, Scott, is and this is important, I think, is that people may say that the hunting instinct is disappearing out of society. That may be true, but I recall that the first time I ever the first time I ever shot skeet was just a couple years ago, and I hit 19 out of 20 on my first time with the rifle. And let me explain to you why that is. It's not because I'm naturally good with a gun or anything. I realized after the fact that the reason I could pick up a skeet rifle and knock 19 clay pigeons down out of my first 20 was because I had this experience hundreds of thousands of times in my life. Hundreds of thousands of times. And I had that experience in video games, playing flight simulators. A flight simulator with when you're dealing with either a World War I fighter, World War II fighter, anything with guns, requires leading the target. And I have shot down hundreds of thousands of computer enemy aircraft. And every time you're in a different airplane against a different airplane, that lead is different. But I got so absolutely used to it. I got so used to pulling lead on a target and figuring it out that when I actually got a chance to do it in the real world, it was relatively straightforward. And the main point of all of this is only to say that I said just a few moments ago that I don't have a particularly strong hunter instinct, but something's driving me to spend significant hours of my life shooting down hundreds of thousands of computer-generated aircraft. I've shot down thousands of Zeros and Fokkers and MiGs and all the rest, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And I do that because there's something tremendously appealing to me about the ability to pull lead on a target. It's just it's a visceral kind of a satisfaction, and it allows me to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of my life on it because it relaxes me. And so even though the undoubtedly the amount of hunters in the real world, actual hunters, is decreasing, there are many aspects of computer games and many aspects perhaps of some other things, mostly computer games, that provide that sort of visceral experience. Combat games like Call of Duty being high among them, this whole idea of people who play a video game where they go out with other friends in Arma or something like that, and it's a squad of 5 guys and you're fighting off a bunch of terrorists. It's all the same thing. It's that primal instinct that's mostly in men, mostly, but not exclusively, that primal instinct to see an enemy or a target down there, take cover, sneak around, get into position, wait for the shot, and then pull the trigger. In the computer world, you're just knocking out electrons. But that biology that drives that is part of the human condition. And I'd be willing to bet you that if you were to take a look if you were to include the people that did things like that, I know real hunters are mocking this, and I don't blame you one bit, frankly. But if you were to take a look at the number of people who play various forms of computer games, either flight sims or ground-based sims or whatever, and if you took a look at the number of those people of all ages, including very young people, and really got down to what about the experience it was that was so enthralling to them, what you would find is that they're all hunters, all of them. There's that hunting instinct built into them. And that the reason they go back to play these computer games again and again and again and again for hours and hours and hours is because that instinct is so strong in us that it doesn't seem to be going away, and I don't think it can go away. And without question, we would not be having this discussion if that fundamental instinct were not here. And this is the very last point, honest to God. People who talk about being kind to animals, people who say I could never kill a deer, I could never butcher a hog, vegetarians. I have respect for people who are vegetarians. I really do, honest to God. But the reason that people can have that attitude, Scott, is because they're not hungry. It's just that simple, really. It's because they're not hungry. We can afford to be kind to animals in this society, and I'm a big animal kindness guy, because we're not hungry. If we're hungry, that changes very fast. You'd be surprised how fast that changes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful for the support of the members at BillWhittle.com who have made it possible for us to make this show. And many of those are going to be joining us on a cruise in May from the 15th through the 18th, going out of the port of Miami, headed for the Bahamas, a 3-night cruise that we invite you to join. You can find out more by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking the big picture of the boat. There you can also join as a member if you haven't done so yet. And we also want to say a special thank you to our friends over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, who have contributed in a co-promotional effort with us to this. Check out that link in the description below. I think you're going to be glad you did, and you're going to make it one of your regular stops on a daily basis. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott.
I should point out that my strong pitch to have a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the nose of that cruise ship and chum the waters and just basically blast sharks all day was somehow rejected by the wimps at the cruise line company and all the other eco-weenies. But I thought that was going to be a real big draw.
Why we even let him talk about this trip, I don't know. Thank you to the members of BillWhittle.com for making this possible. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott.